Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm just going to do this quick video that finishes some of the notes for the topic of labor rights and looking at labor unions and some of the responses to this shift in industrial work. This is kind of broad, but it echoes maybe some of the things that you read in the American Yawp. So just a couple of things. If we take a look at this slide that we have up, this just reminds us that for labor unions in the time period, and maybe in class we looked at the Knights of Labor as a really early form of labor union that was pretty inclusive in terms of like skilled and unskilled workers, but something that we see occur, and this is maybe especially the case in the Haymarket Affair or the Haymarket Massacre, depending on which text you read, it might be referred to in different ways, but this is the aftermath of a labor strike, and there are people who are killed as police show up to try to squelch a particular protest. Bombs are thrown and people are killed, and those who are accused of throwing the bomb include people who are immigrants, as well as people who kind of have anarchist ideas, maybe socialist ideas. And so radical ideas in the early 1900s start to become something that taints labor unions and at least the public opinion of labor unions. And we'll look at that, kind of issue a little bit more. Another labor union that perhaps is a little bit more significant because it gets a little larger, it also lasts a lot longer. This is a labor union that's founded in 1886, and you can see Sam Gompers, who becomes somebody who is influential in the time period, somebody who represents skilled workers, and is in some ways like kind of the spokesperson for some of their rights. There's also some focus for Sam Gompers on working with the government. So unlike maybe socialism or anarchy, which kind of are ideas that maybe threaten the nature of the government as the source of solving problems for workers, Sam Gompers is looking to kind of not necessarily challenge capitalism as an economic system, but to work in defining some of the rules that make capitalism become a little bit more fair. So taking some of the idea of like laissez-faire out of capitalism, creating greater rules for workers, especially industrial workers. And this particular labor union, instead of being like one large union that people just kind of are members of, it's really an association of much smaller unions that are very specific based on industry, right? So steel workers or a particular type of worker. This is a union that does have a high degree of nativism in it. We see a lot of anti-immigration types of rhetoric within this particular group, and this is also a focus on skilled workers. This is not necessarily representative. It's not a union that represents unskilled workers. This is really largely skilled workers. And some of the big issues, this is referred to sometimes as bread and butter unionism. This particular group really takes to Congress some new hopes for laws that focus on higher wages, an 8-hour workday. The 8-hour workday is not embedded in law at this point, so there aren't a great deal of restrictions on the number of hours that somebody can work, say, for example, without getting paid overtime. In an essay that's quite famous, Sam Gompers writes this essay called What a Working Man Wants, and it does establish some arguments for why individuals who are workers need to have some time dedicated to other pursuits, maybe to invent, maybe to learn, maybe to sleep. He has a variety of different arguments that work productivity is not something that can just endlessly increase. There's a, kind of law of diminishing returns. You ultimately reach a point where you don't necessarily get more productivity for the amount of time that somebody's putting in. So you kind of have a variety of arguments for better working conditions, 8-hour day, and higher wages. And these become really the focus for a lot of new legislation. And one of the outgrowths of the Gilded Age and some of the problems problems of this time period where there's such a mismatch between the way in which capitalism works and what some of the needs of the players in capitalism might be. Workers and corporations, for example, find themselves very far apart. There is a little bit more of a role for the government. And even though that may not happen to a large degree during the Gilded Age, it's the problems that occur during the Gilded Age that set up, future movements, which become progressive movements and other movements where the role of the government is really the focus of reform. And this is maybe one specific area where we do see the achievement in the time period, even before the turn of the century, of the 8-hour workday. Better working conditions take some time, but that includes things like targeting child labor, which by the turn of the century into the first few decades of the early 1900s, we see a lot of action, against child labor. There are a couple of other strikes that really do happen that become really significant. We addressed the Homestead strike in class. A couple of things about this particular strike. One is it's in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and it's at a steel plant that is owned by Andrew Carnegie. And so this becomes significant because now we have, representation from a very large kind of corporate player. And Carnegie was known for really speaking out in favor of workers' rights, and perhaps even making a case that he was paying higher wages. So we have a great deal of irony in the Homestead strike, just because at kind of face value, there's a great deal of pushing aside of the steel workers. Some of this has to do with the manager of the Homestead, plant, this steel plant, and we see this becomes a strike that occurs largely because workers are locked out. There's a lot of talk about workers striking. Henry Clay Frick will lock the workers out and largely hire other workers, and this leads to a great deal of violence. There is a group, kind of almost like a security group of sorts, the Pinkerton detectives. They are involved in protecting or even being some of the workers who replace the folks who are locked out. So there's a great deal of mayhem and people who are killed. And this particular event is another one that affects public opinion. One of the biggest challenges that unions and workers have is, on one hand, they're seen as marginalized in society, and maybe perhaps there is a lot of public support for the idea that workers aren't really getting their fair due, are being overworked, and there's a lot of relevance of some of the issues that people are fighting for. But at the same time, there's also some large critiques of working men. And some of this is also connected to class issues at the time, and some like segregation of spaces based on class. The saloon is one example of this. So workers kind of depicted as if having more leisure time might be, in the local tavern getting drunk. And so there's a great deal of like questions over, who this working man is and what type of role they're going to play in society, and what the obligations are between government, business, and workers. And so that's kind of part of what some of these strikes are, getting at the heart of some of those issues. The Homestead strike ends up being very significant, right? So this is about pay cuts, which could happen very easily in a lot of cases in the time period. People would just find, well, your salary has been decreased, and it requires a great deal of upset. And, this does lead to violence, and many labor unions do really get painted, probably unfairly in a lot of cases, with being the perpetrators of a great deal of violence. Okay, so the Pinkertons are this like kind of security group that really ends up being the, kind of trying a mediator, but it also kind of riles up some of what's happening. The National Guard ends up being called in as a result, and the governor of Pennsylvania has to try to, stop the violence, reopen the plant, and there's kind of a, huge amount of public opinion that gets negative after the Homestead strike. You can kind of see some of the kind of political cartoons of the time. So, this worker, seeing, protected by the McKinley tariff and a Pinkerton army, the Homestead Mill, so Carnegie, and, there is a presence that, the corporation is kind of untouchable, right? Whereas the worker, is locked out, wages reduced 30%, and so on. So lots of messaging in the media regarding some of the ways in which workers are being affected. One other example is kind of an interesting one, the Pullman Rail Company. Pullman cars are the cars that people took on the railways that they could stay overnight in. So the Pullman Rail Car Company has a variety of different types of products, but these are largely passenger rail cars that get produced. And Pullman is a company that exists essentially in a large town called Pullman. And Pullman is a company town. So everything that you need as a worker to work for the Pullman factory is in this particular town. So this is a street, for example, in the town of Pullman. We were born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we should go to Pullman hell. The idea is that every worker in the town lives in the town and also works for the Pullman factory. Instead of being paid in monetary wages, people are paid in script, which they can then use to shop essentially in Pullman shops. And what happens during the Pullman strike, sorry, I went ahead too fast. The Pullman strike is that the wages are not the costs of the things to buy are increased, but there is no increase in the script. And so people are forced essentially to have less. And so this particular control over the workforce by the Pullman company creates a massive, massive strike. And Eugene Debs becomes significant as a political figure. This also gives us a little bit of an introduction to socialism in the time period. Eugene Debs was somebody who had been a labor activist, and probably much more so as a fan of capitalism to some degree. He was a labor leader who was thrown into jail because he didn't really follow a federal order to end a strike. He becomes a massively significant advocate of industrial unionism. He kind of radicalizes a bit in jail, reads a great deal of Karl Marx, and starts to really lean on the idea that capitalism will ultimately sort of self-destruct. And the way to solve this particular issue is to put the factors of production in the hands of workers. So he becomes part of a little bit more of a socialist form of unionism. So this just kind of gives us an idea of the large movement of this in the early 1900s, and we see, this line up with a sense what becomes the Russian Revolution in the time period of 1917, a little bit later, but some of that is building. So there's a lot of American labor interest in what's happening in Russia. Also, there is a court case in 1895. There is a kind of question about whether or not Eugene Debs can be jailed for some of his refusal, in a sense, to kind of sit down. He is part of a strike, and the government tries to end the strike and put him in jail. He challenges that, but the courts actually find that the government can arrest him because he is in a union that is striking, because he was interfering with interstate commerce, with the postal service, and with the general welfare. So, we kind of see the role of the courts again dictate, in a sense, what the role of workers will be, what the role of the corporations will be. Lastly, we'll just note this is like a nice kind of description of craft unionism, which is really the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Skilled workers, there's a great deal of nativism and discrimination within this group. It's really focused on skilled industrial jobs that are primarily held by white men who see themselves as very nativist, and this is not necessarily open to Black industrial workers or immigrant industrial workers. We also see on the right a little bit more of a socialist or industrial unionism idea. We see a union known as the Industrial Workers of the World, sometimes referred to as the Wobblies. This is really an international movement. It lines up with Marxists elsewhere, and this becomes one where we see a large role for women